In this episode of Toolbox, I'll go over some of the complexity that is plaguing CSS and making specificity harder to figure out. We'll take a look at what frameworks are doing to help you develop simpler ways of designing sites. The pace of the web is relentless, and that's why you need the Toolbox. Hello everyone, this is Ray Villalobos, and I stream about front-end and full-stack tools Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Follow me and subscribe on all the social media things for more content. Now, if you want to watch any past episodes, make sure you take a look at my blog, raybo.org. So this week I'm going to talk about how CSS is getting really complicated. It used to be, when I first got started, that it was fairly easy, but more and more complexity gets added to the language, and it makes things like specificity really difficult to figure out. So before I do that, though, I'm going to start by going over some cool sites that I think you should know about. I usually call that section the shorts. I've been trying to think of changing the name of it, but I have all the branding set to the shorts already. So I'm going to keep it for now. Maybe it'll be something that I can update a little bit later. So let's take a look at some of the tools that I've been talking about. And by the way, this is my blog at raybo.org. If you want to look for any of the links or any of the things that I'm talking about today, you can take a look at this article. This is the latest article on the site. And then at the bottom, you can see links to everything that I'll be covering. So the main website looks like this. This is also where you can get my videos, all the past episodes of the Toolbox. Take a look at the shorts, which is what I'm going to be talking about in a minute. And then take a look at other things like my newsletters and my social media, just in case you want to get any of that. So let's go on to the shorts. So I'm going to start off with a website called Rising Stars. This is a pretty cool website that I use every so often. And what it does is let me know how well different frameworks are doing. So it really focuses on JavaScript frameworks, not CSS specifically, but you can see the most popular projects overall, specifically just front-end frameworks, Node.js frameworks, et cetera, et cetera. There's this whole category of like back-end frameworks right now that is pretty interesting. So I love going through the site, CSS and JavaScript, which is like a little bit scary to me. And one of the interesting things that I found was a while back, I went through all of the different current build tools that are out in the market. And, so I went through, I started with like Grunt and then Gulp, and then I went to like Webpack, which I really didn't like. And then I got into other things. And lately, there's been a lot of like new tools that make updating things super fast. And I went through a lot of the new ones. And I ended up going between like Snowpack and Vite. And it's pretty interesting that Vite has really, I think, won that award, the current go-to build tools. And you'll see it in all the new frameworks out there. So I think that if you haven't tried it yet, go check it out. I've done some previous episodes on Vite itself and how easy it is to do things. You'll see me using it over and over. But it's nice that I was right all along. I'm sometimes pretty good about figuring out things that are going to win, just honestly based on what I think works for me. So you can see Vite is the overall, I think, winner. There's also this thing called ZX. So this is kind of interesting, something for writing better scripts. I think what it does is it lets you run terminal commands in JavaScript. So it's essentially like bash scripts in JavaScript. It's really shot up, so interesting. Not something that I would use every day, but still. If you take a look at frameworks, this is pretty interesting. Notice that React is at the top, and the next most popular framework is Vue.js. I thought that was interesting. However, one of the mentions here is that Vue.js actually separates their different versions. So whereas some frameworks, some GitHub repos that are like built as mono repos, everything is in one huge repo. So when they update, they don't necessarily change the repo itself. Whereas Vue.js has a new repo for like version 3 and version 2. So technically, they say that Vue.js should be the #1 front-end framework, just because it's split into 2, and just I guess this is maybe 3. It is already at #2. The other interesting thing is, take a look at this. Like, Angular went below Svelte. So whereas I've always been talking about the different frameworks, React, Vue, and Angular, maybe now I need to start talking about React, Vue, and Svelte. So as I mentioned, in previous podcasts, streams, that the main developer for Svelte is now working for Vercel, and that's a pretty interesting development. You just imagine that fellow, I think is I can't remember his name, but that was his part-time job. Like, when I think he was working for a major newspaper. I want to say New York Times. So just imagine now that he has all the time to focus on Svelte, what is going to happen with that project. So really interesting to see that Angular sort of got bumped, and honestly, it looks like by sort of quite a bit. The difference between 9.3 and 13.6 thousand stars is pretty solid there. And there's this other framework that's sort of trying to kind of peek up in here called Solid. I've tried it. Too much TypeScript for me. Alpine is fantastic. I did something on that a while back. I've seen Lit sort of come up as well. Preact is always in there. That's sort of like a clone of React that is really performant. And there's stuff in here that I don't even know. So anyways, this is a great place to look at sort of what's going on with especially JavaScript frameworks if you're interested. Now, another thing that I found was this website called Doodle Ipsum. So it's like a lorem ipsum. A lot of times when you're prototyping things, you tend to put in some Greek text, and we call that lorem ipsum. So this is sort of the same thing for illustrations. And it's just a free site where you can have it feed you images of different sizes, and then you can copy the code. There's also a language that you can use. So you can see the URL is really specific, so that you can actually just modify the URL once you learn the language of this, and then get to a bunch of different images. I think if I refresh this page, you would see different sizes, different photos, and I guess I can just hit the shuffle button. So you get sort of a random photo. I think there's a way of maybe not making them random. So cool for when you have to do a quick demo and just need some images other than you'll see the picture of my dog in the demo that I did today, that I'm doing today. So that's cool. Another site, and this is really relevant to what I'm talking about today. This site is called Simple CSS. What I love about this is that it's a classless CSS framework. When you first started using HTML, the first thing you realize is that the browsers have these like horrible styles, like horrible defaults. So everything is like Times New Roman, 16 pixels, like really tiny. There's like borders around the edge of the page that you have to worry about. So this gives you sort of a decent looking style sheet where you don't have to actually add any classes to anything. So you just put in an H1, an H2, and everything looks pretty decent. It even has this navigation, and clearly this is an example of how the framework looks. And you can see that it's pretty decent. There's a dark and a light mode. I always run on dark mode, so that's why you see it as being dark right here. So it's sort of like the anti-Bootstrap or anti-Tailwind. It's trying to give you a nice looking sans serif local font stack, best practices, and it has dark mode in it, responsive, etc., etc. Super tiny. And even if you don't end up using it, I think that it's also a good thing to sort of take a peek out for what the how you should be writing your CSS for like a very basic page. I'm not really a fan of this navigation, but it is just that simple. I wish that was a little bit better. And if you go to the docs, you can see some of the demos. Oh, maybe not the docs. Let's see. Is there like a demo maybe. Yeah, I think somewhere, yeah, here's the page where you can see what your headline level 1 is going to be, set to 3 rems. So you can see how everything looks by default. So by default, it gives you a descent button. If you use Tailwinds, you know that just to get a button, you need like 16 classes. So it's nice that all you have to do to write this button is just either write a link or write a button or write an ahref. That's interesting. This looks wrong because I guess you write an anchor tag and then you wrap it you wrap a button inside it. So other typographic elements like lists, everything just looks really nice by default. You know, if you need to do something quick, also I've used this for if I need to do a demo and I want something that looks pretty decent as a default so I don't have to like use normalize or, you know, use any sort of like import any resets or anything like that. I can just start off with something that looks pretty cool. So the block quotes look pretty good. Let's see. It has sort of sort of default code style. So I've used this and I really enjoy it. And it's definitely one way of making your items, like your CSS, it's a lot simpler because you don't have to write anything. So every once in a while I have to think of like the topics for what I'm going to be talking about. And for this one, I was trying to figure out, okay, what's really bugging me at the moment. That's how I come up with the topics. And one of the things that I ran into was this sort of State of CSS report. And I've used it in previous episodes as well. And there's a little bit of a problem right now with the plot itself. So I'm going to have to come over here and show you this part right here. So when I was showing you this a few weeks ago in one of the other episodes, I noticed something pretty interesting here. And that is that if you look at the sort of the state of the CSS frameworks based on the survey of about like 9,000, 8,000, 9,000 people, you'll notice that the sort of, framework with the best user satisfaction is SASS. It's clearly the winner. There's other things that people are pretty happy with. So you can see here things like PostCSS, style components, which is crazy to me. And BEM also, of course, is pretty close. You can see some of these things right here. There's actually another tab in the dynamic graphic that shows you, that kind of dives a little bit into what people are figuring out or want to know what to learn. So what people want to learn. At the top of that is Tailwind CSS. And these other things will sort of rearrange a little bit differently. Look, interesting that Bootstrap has sort of gone from definitely adopt to something that you should take a look at and reassess to see whether it's something that you want to continue to be using. So so BEM, so I have some questions here. Maybe somebody is asking something, so let's just go ahead and pull that up. So I was about to ask about BEM method, and you mentioned about classes and how I don't really hate BEM. Like, I love some of the way that BEM is adopted, and it has made an impact on how almost every framework is written. Like if you look at Bootstrap, it's BEM-E, not Tailwinds. Tailwinds is its own thing. So I like the concept of BEM, but I'm not sure that I'm sort of getting away from that super structured way of writing CSS because for all the reasons that Tailwinds mentions, it's becoming a little cumbersome, and I'll dive into more of that at the moment. But I think if you're in, I used to work for Tribune Interactive, so if you're in a big company, having sort of a defined way of how you approach writing your classes, I think is really smart, especially when you're working in a team that is much bigger than yourself. So figuring out how everybody's going to do things, I think it's a fantastic thing. But as things develop, I'm finding that approach might not have been sort of the best. So, and then another thing that drove me into this discussion of the complexity. So let me go ahead and hide this comment. So thank you, Eric. I'm sure I'm going to butcher that name. So Eric. Oh, Eric, cool. Thank you for the parentheses. All right, so another thing that started me on this topic was watching this fantastic video from Una Kravitz. And you can see it in the link, so I'm going to pause it.
Hello, happy Friday. My name is Una.
Yeah, so this video is discussing a new feature that is coming up in CSS called Layers. It's pretty much what you think it's going to be, and Una provides this fantastic little place where you can sort of take a look at a CodePen with a demo. It doesn't have really anything, but it gives you sort of a lot of links here to things. So basically, this new feature in CSS that is just hitting browsers right now is designed to allow you to create layers. And it's not the z-index layers that we're used to in CSS. It's like a Photoshop layers type thing where, the thing, in this case, in the CSS case, the things that the order of the layers is definitely relevant. So, things in different arrangements will have more or less specificity, right? And you can actually redefine the specificity order that you want your layers to be. So it's essentially like nested, nesting the style. So you can see here that we have this layer base and it ends over, actually, it ends right here. And then in here, we add like a couple of different classes. So you can see that we can create sort of a set of layers. And then we can define how those are added. Well, that adds to a lot of specificity issues. Specificity just means that when you are writing CSS, oftentimes you write maybe like you have some normalized styles and then you have some other styles. And those styles are designed to override the normalized overrides what the browser defaults are. But then you write your CSS and that is designed to override something that maybe the override did. And so the more things that get added to CSS, the more complicated that is. And a lot of times you end up writing things that are going to override the things that you wrote, and it just gets to be a little messy. So at some point, you have to sort of wonder if you're sort of doing the right thing. So if you look at some of the other features that are, coming in CSS, one of them is container query. So this is an interesting feature, and this feature essentially allows you. They're like media queries, but they don't have to be relative to the viewport. So a lot of times when you write media queries, you say, if my browser or if my device is this wide, then I want you to do this. And then when my device is this wide, then I want you to do something else. So the thing with container queries, essentially, you don't have to be asked for an element or a div to align itself based on the size of the viewport. You can modify things based on the available size for that media query at the moment. So you can say, if I don't have a lot of room, then make the layout vertical. If I have a lot of horizontal room, then make the layout horizontal. So it's no longer based on the viewports, it's based on the available room for the thing. And so the cool thing is that this is very powerful, but again, it's adding to the complexity. It's a great feature, but it's just going to make it harder and harder to maybe figure out things like specificity. And that's fine. I mean, I think I like that the language continues to evolve. It's evolving in amazing and fantastic ways, but it almost feels like at some point we're just going to have machines doing the layout because the layouts are just getting complicated to do and then also to maintain. And generally, you will have to worry a lot more about now that you have the ability to control not just per viewport, but per available size. Now you're going to have to worry about that. Think about how far something like the display property has come. So display property, when you first learn it, you figure out that you have essentially, you start out with like a couple, display block and display inline. And then you learn that there's this really cool thing called display inline block. And then maybe you learn that there's like flex and grid, but there's like an inline flex and an inline grid. Inline grid. And there's now something called flow root. I'm not sure what that is, actually. I'm going to have to ask Morten. And then there's all these two-value syntax of block flow. It's getting nuts. And then there's actually like a ton of table classes, table row classes. There's a display list item. It's just getting more and more complex, and it's almost like some of the programs that start out great, like Photoshop, starts out fantastic, but then at some point it's like it's so complicated that you almost get overwhelmed by the amount of work that you have to do. So that's sort of, what I think a lot of frameworks are trying to solve. So I see frameworks as an attempt to solve problems that aren't being addressed by the main languages. And that's why I think they're good. Also, that the things that are happening on frameworks today are the features that you're going to see on CSS tomorrow. Case in point, a lot of things that you see in SASS and things like calculations and variables have made it into CSS. Now, there's a lot of things that are trying to make it from SASS that aren't there yet. So, for example, if you take a look at this is the display property. I don't know if I meant to say, no, I didn't mean to say this. So, for example, you take a look at something like nesting. That is a feature. Like we see that nesting already in media queries. I don't know why this site is not loading right now. Hopefully my web connection is good. You see a lot of, sort of nesting. So I'm going to close that. So you see a lot of nesting in things like the layers that we just showed you. So these layers are nested, right? So media queries, I've had this for a while, but the ability to nest things is something that appeared in SASS a long time ago. Same thing with variables. However, I think that, if you want, so my point is, if you want to take a look at what's going to happen with CSS in the future, is you should take a look at what frameworks are trying to solve today and see what other features they have. So I just finished recording this update to this course on SASS. So if you go to sasslang.com, you'll see that SASS has all these fantastic features. So maybe under Learn SASS, I'll show you it had variables. So SASS is a language that is 15 years old. So just let that hit you for a second. 15 years is like several lifetimes in the web. That language has been around for that long, and it still has the most user satisfaction currently. So definitely super popular, and it has features that aren't even implemented into CSS quite yet. Also, there's a way in which I think variables or custom properties, how they're called in CSS, are not as good as SASS variable, because SASS variables will compile into regular CSS. So if you create a variable here, when this converts into CSS, you're not going to see all of this. Whereas in CSS, you're going to see every one of your variables. So I think that sometimes the compiled sort of approach of SASS is a lot better. So that's definitely something to think about. Now, nesting is this feature right here. So you have the ability of putting things inside other things. This is fantastic because it helps you figure out what belongs to what. And something else that happens when you write a lot of CSS is you sometimes will have a piece of CSS up here, and then you do some overrides, and then down here you'll have another piece of the same CSS. So nesting, once it gets added, it's going to be really powerful. It will allow you to sort of organize things a little bit better. However, things like partials are things that are always going to be better in SASS, because SASS lets you import different pieces of CSS. So you have this base CSS, and then in this styles.css, you say, I want you to use this right here. In the regular CSS language, all that will be, either different calls, maybe once they implement modules, or it ends up being just this huge style sheet. Whereas because it's pre-processed, SASS gives you that ability. And then you have things like mix-ins and other features. So SASS is pretty cool. I think that it's so great that if you haven't used it, it's really worth looking at. Again, it's the type of thing that I would use if I was maintaining a lot of bigger style sheets. One of the things that I love in SASS is these ability to create extend classes, which are fantastic. So here's one of the samples from my course. You can see that I'm using that simple CSS to sort of set a basic default here. But the cool thing about extend is the ability for you to create a nested sort of button here. And then you have this is called the parent selector. I think that's coming to on CSS. But again, SASS had it 15 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that. And then you can just say, I want to extend this current class in this subclass called button primary, right? And in here, you can look at the compiled version of this. notice that it's really smart about also, collapsing the amount of CSS that it generates. So it grabbed all of the classes that are shared, put them into this rule, right? And then it gives you the additional subclasses only with the new things that you need for that subclass. You can see that writing with SASS is a lot smarter. Another thing that I love about SASS is just this really hugely rich set of classes related to modifying colors. So we have this like color scale class that allows you to take an existing color and just make it darker. So when we create a button, for example, so you'll see these, actually these are badges. But when I roll over these buttons, it's creating the slightly darker version of that badge by just letting me use this method called color scale. And again, the parent selector combined with the color scale, combined with the fact that this is going to be processed, and while the process is taking place, it's going to give you a much more collapsed version of the styles that it would write. Yeah, custom properties, somebody did say, this is a good point, that custom properties can be changed in JavaScript. Yep, that's true, but, and I agree about, that's good, I agree about partials in SASS. Very snappy. Yeah, partial, I mean, it's funny that it's 15 years old, and I think it still does so much that we still don't have, and that I don't think even when CSS gets some of these features, I don't think they're going to be as good because of the process nature of SASS. So this isn't a SASS. I didn't expect this to be like a SASS thing. So some of the frameworks are using, one of the ways that frameworks are trying to make things simpler is by using this concept of CSS variable presets. That's something that's been pretty new. It's super interesting to take a look at. So you can see something like assembler CSS. This is just a crazy idea. And basically what it does is it allows you to create designs with some preset variables. So if you read the documentation, you can see that it's also letting you go closer to the style attribute. So instead of writing a bunch of classes that override each other, you just go to the specific div and then you type in a bunch of classes that are almost exactly, either exactly like what you would use in the style attribute or what you would use in the CSS rule itself. But then it gives you shortcuts that are in the same sort of vein as Tailwind CSS. So the language, actually it's very compatible with Tailwinds. The way that you write some of these rules are sort of interesting. So I'm seeing a lot of frameworks that are trying to make things easier by almost eliminating the cascade. And I've shown you this before, but if you go to any website, like my website, most of the time when you inspect element on any of these, I went to another window here, so let's see. So you have these two tabs. The Styles tab shows you the cascade, and it shows you the order in which styles are being applied and overwritten. So when you see something like this, it means that this style is being overwritten by a later rule, right? So a lot of times when we're trying to debug CSS, we end up going to the computed tag because this tells us once it gets done with the cascade, what is actually being applied. So these frameworks are thinking, well, why don't we just sort of tell the CSS what it's going to end up looking like, and that would be kind of a simpler and more consistent way of writing CSS. So something like assembler, that's what it's trying to do. It's very freaky, I'll give it to them. It's like really weird to work with it, but I think I'm just noticing more and more of these things appearing. I think Tailwinds led the way with the utility first approach, but I'm seeing now a couple of frameworks that are looking at how do we do this in a way that is sort of simpler than Tailwinds, where we define a design language and a set of pre-built variables that will allow you to do something similar. So the other thing is that you can actually create a mix-in. So this is interesting with assembler. You can create a mix-in so that you don't have to redo things over and over. So that's one of the disadvantages of Tailwind. Although there's ways around it, you can create mix-ins in assembler, and you could do something similar in Tailwind CSS as well. So I like this framework. I also showed you there's another simpler one called Pollen that I've demoed before, and you can go look at the at the previous episodes as well. And it's trying to do some things not quite as complicated as assembler, but it's giving you a bunch of variables, right? That will show you, will give you a design language that is consistent. That's one of the things that Tailwind tries to do, that is consistent, and then it's closer to the style attribute in the way that you write them. So sort of interesting, a couple of interesting sort of ways of looking at what we could be trying to do to make our lives simpler. So here is, I believe, an example of this. And you can see that, let's see if it shows up. It's taking a second. So you can see, like, this is a little design that I did on one of the previous episodes, and it's a little responsive design that I did with Alpine, actually, for the data, and then using this Pollen CSS set of variables to design something. So that's a good sort of example, if you want to play around with it, of what you can do with sort of a preset number of variables. So I talked about Tailwind before, Tailwind CSS. Tailwind's approach is what we call a utility-based approach, and it really changed the CSS world. Why is it so cool? It's because it does the same thing. It tries to like get closer to writing style attributes, but it defines a consistent language, and it's very good with component-based architecture. So things like Vue.js, React, things that are component-based. This is actually the thing that you should probably be using, because it's really bad if you have to repeat a bunch of code. So if you have a bunch of, like, I don't know, list items, and I don't know, list items is not a good idea. But if you use the things over and over, then it gets a little more tricky, because you do have to create kind of like mix-ins to take care of it. So what it's letting you do is just defines a language, and then it allows you to create a series of classes that are closer to what you would put in the style tag. So the content very closely, it tells you exactly how it's going to display. It's not like a class that you have to go into the specificity sort of order to figure out what it's going to look like and how you're going to overwrite something that you've done earlier. The styles that you add to each one of the elements are pretty much what's going to be in the compile tab of your inspect screen. So that is one of the sort of revolutionary things about Tailwind CSS. Here I have an example of how just to show you how noisy it is when you're making simple things. These are just a series of buttons, but take a look at the code that you have to write to do like a simple button. You have to do like, we have different versions of it here, but around it, then you specify the border, then the color of the border, then the weight of the text, the color of the text, how much padding you want in each direction, and the fact that you want to center some text. So it's just a crazy amount of code just to make a button. Again, there's ways of making that simpler. If you're doing a component-based architecture, then you create the button, you add all the styles directly into the component. This is no big deal. So I don't recommend this for non-component architectures, but definitely something that you should learn, because it erases that worry about what is my thing going to look like. It just looks like whatever styles you put in there. So it's actually pretty cool. I'm a big fan. So I'm also noticing the sort of different new frameworks that are attempting this way of doing, working with preset styles. And I found this pretty cool new framework called Open. Let's see, I don't know if I have a link to it. It's in here. So it looks like I don't have the link to it, but it's called openprops.style. So this is sort of a hybrid. It has a bunch of variables, a lot of really cool features. So I did a little video for you to look at about this framework. I think you're going to like it. And I think, again, it's trying to make things simpler, hopefully. So let's take a look. One of the ways that some CSS frameworks are trying to make things easier is by giving you a set of predefined variables that can help you create a consistent look for your sites. In CSS, variables are known as custom properties. So this framework is called Open Props because they offer some preset variables that you can use. By using the variables, you're creating a design language that is consistent across your different components. If you look, for example, at how colors are put together, the variables use a color name and then a number from 0 to 9. The same structure exists, for example, when you get to typography, and then you specify things like font size or font weight and use the same type of numbers. The naming conventions for the variables are pretty easy to follow. Once you start working with the variables, you'll have an idea of how all the variables work. Also, it's incrementally adaptable, which means that you can grab all the props, just the props that you need, or the props in JavaScript mode. You can also customize the props yourself if you want to have a different name for the variables using JavaScript or the command line. Let's take a look at how you would lay something out with this framework. All right, so we have a div right now with a class of layout. Inside that, we have a section that has some content over here. And then we have this aside that has the picture of my dog here, Mr. Mojo, the coding dog. Now inside this section, I have a header section. There's a couple of headlines in there. And then I have a paragraph here. And I have a little button. All right, so let's go ahead and make this section a lot bigger. And I want to take you to how you install this. There's actually a bunch of different ways of doing it. And notice that you can get this CSS file called open props, and you can also get this other one called normalize. They each have a little piece of the whole framework, and then you can actually also import each individual package by itself. And notice that there's also a lot of packages that are coming up, so that should be pretty interesting once this gets fleshed out a little bit. To get started, you choose how you're going to be working with this. If you're working with NPM, you do an NPM install, and then you can refer to the different files from what you download. We're going to use the CDN, and if you check this out, you can see that I can just open these props and this normalized file directly from the CDN. So that's what I'm going to start. I'm going to start pasting these two things. You'll see that the layout is already changed a little bit. All right, so now that I have that, I can do target my class of layout, and I'll set this to display grid. And then I'm going to do a grid template columns. And I'm going to do a 2-column layout, so it'll be one fractional width and then another one so that things will show up side by side. Then we're going to create some CSS for each of the columns. So the way that I have this coded, I have the sort of section in a column by itself, and then the picture is also on a separate column by itself right here. So I'm going to do something with the columns. I'll do align content center here. This will center the columns in the space that we have available. And I'm going to set the height to 100 viewport height. They'll sort of make the content be extremely tall. And then I'm going to target a class called content. And I'm going to add some spacing parameters here. So padding. And I can use some of the variables here from the framework. So for padding, I'm going to start using size 10. So it's going to give it a lot of padding. And in the framework, for the most part, all of your sizes are going to be from 1 to something. Sometimes they'll go all the way up to 10. Sometimes they'll be a little bit lower. It just depends on the particular sort of item that you are targeting. So you can see that I have all these relative sizes from 0.5 rems all the way to 30 rems. So I can go all the way up to 15. And I'm using 10 just to give myself some breathing room around all of my content. All right, I'm also going to do a display of grid right here. And I'm going to use the gap property to add a little bit of space in between my items. So this will be between the headlines and the other two pieces here. So I can use the variables again. So in here, let's go ahead and do just the background color. And I'm going to use orange 1 just to change the background of the item on the left. Then I'll do the headline level 1. I'll set the color here to again use another one of the variables. So So I can use blue, and again, you can use different numbers, and I don't need this colon, so that's why it's not looking right. So blue 7, so for headline level 1, and then we'll play with the font size as well. There's actually at the bottom of the screen a lot of links to all of the different sections, so you can very quickly go here to typography and find out what the different parameters are. So I love these little sliders that it has, so you could see kind of what the different parameters are. So here's the font sizes that we can play with. All right, so let's do the headline level 2, which is the other headline, and let's go ahead and copy these, and I'll just paste them in here. So for the H2, I'm going to use a gray color of 6, and my font size is going to be smaller at 4, and then I can do a font weight here, and that is going to be variable font weight, and it has, again, the same number, so it doesn't use, a lot of frameworks will use something like bold, regular, light here. This one just gives you the same numbers over and over. So it's a little bit different, but I think it works. Let's go ahead and do our paragraph now. I like sort of lighter font weights for my text, and this isn't going to look good until we change the color. And we'll use gray 6. I think that looks pretty good. All right, it looks like I need to fix my column a little bit. So actually, I should have put a colon here for align content center so that it brings everything together in the middle of the layout here. So that's good. And let's see. It looks like I'm missing a semicolon here as well. And we can start working on our button. So margin auto will make it not go the full width of the item. And we'll do padding inline, and once you get used to these sizes, you don't end up looking for a lot of the values. We'll use a size 3 just to give ourselves a little bit more breathing room, sort of on the top on the sides of the button. Let's do a size 2. I think that looks a little bit better. We'll try another blue color here. What we do need to do, however, is figure out the hover state. So we'll do a button hover state, and very easily just change the background to another color. So just now when we roll over, you get sort of a brighter version of this blue. And we gotta fix the image pix. That is an image. Make the object fit, and we'll make that cover. And we forgot to put a period here, and sort of always try to fit in the container that is available for the image. You can see that most of the classes are going to be super easy to remember, and that this framework gives you a set of different classes that will help you lay things out in a consistent manner. I do like these font fluid sizes, which are clamped, which means that they grow and shrink with the design. There's also a lot of easing functions, which are pretty cool. Built-in animation functions, so you can click and take a look at what these are like, and you can see some samples here. So the documentation is fantastic for this. It has a very cool little language for creating most of the things that you're going to need. It has, you can see media queries, z-index, also a lot of nice built-in gradients. So you can scroll and see all of the gradients here. So it feels like a really fairly complete framework already, and you can see that there's going to be a lot of stuff that's being added soon. So I'm really excited to see this framework sort of grow, and it's part of how a lot of newer frameworks are trying to make your lives a lot easier. So you're probably thinking it's debatable as to whether that's easier. I mean, it feels kind of easy to me. Simplifying things, trying to get closer to a simpler, computed sort of final version of what this is going to look like. A lot of smart use of variables. I'm noticing that in a lot of the newer frameworks like this one. And just overall, I'm really enjoying where things are going and how things are sort of becoming I don't know about simpler. There's always something new to learn, but I do like the consistency of some of these platforms. Some people ask some questions. So yeah, this is now, I think I'm in the Q&A section. So I love it when I get just a generic LinkedIn user. So somebody has good privacy settings in their LinkedIn account, which this is great. So what IDE is this? This happens to be it's actually GitHub. If you go to any repo on GitHub, and you take a look at, you can hit the period key, or you can create a link by changing the github.com to github.dev, and it'll give you an editor. This editor is essentially Visual Studio Code. It's just that it's on the browser, which is super cool. And one of the reasons why it's suggesting so many things is that I have an extension called Copilot. Copilot actually will suggest complete functions for you whenever you're typing your code. So it's sort of like a super autocomplete. If you haven't used it, it's amazing. You can sign up for the technical preview. It is pretty amazing. And sometimes I think it tries to write too much for me. So you'll see when I'm doing these demos that it'll often try to give me like a whole style, and not a style that I usually want because I'm demoing something that it doesn't know about. It's pretty smart, but on these weird frameworks, it kind of guesses things that it maybe shouldn't. So that's a good question, though. So yeah, I love the combination of Visual Studio Code, especially online. You can also go to, I think, vscode.dev, or just go to any GitHub repo and just hit the period. It'll launch a coding environment. Also, I'm using something called Code Swing. So Code Swing is what gives me the CodePen type sort of interface, where it's giving me a live preview and an area with HTML and an area with CSS. So that's my combination of things. If you would just go to this repo, so if you go to github.com/planet of the web, this one's called swing-openprobs. And yeah, this is all that it is just a CodeSwing file. You do need the CodeSwing extension installed on your browser when you hit the period here, or you're not going to get all the features. So if you look at my Planet of the Web GitHub repo and just do a search for Swing, you should see in this user, you should see a bunch of different swings that I've done for all the different demos that I give usually on this show every week. So there's a lot of examples. So I think I showed you things like Pollen. There's a demo for Pollen here. There's a demo for Assembler CSS. And there's some demos for like Tailwinds in some of these. And you can find all of them there. So if you haven't done the period on a GitHub repo, it's really amazing. Because if you need to edit something quickly on GitHub, you just hit the period, jump into an editor, and it will just give you a Visual Studio Code editor. So let me see if I have any other questions. Yeah, so I don't see a ton of stuff here. Yeah, thank you so much for Misia Santana. Yeah, cool stuff. I mean, I think it's like I feel like it's my job, or one of the things that I'm trying to do with this toolbox is to kind of show you new things that you may not have known, expose you to new ideas. Like I say at the beginning of every episode, the pace of the web is relentless. It does not stop. I am never going to catch up to everything, but I have enough experience that I can, put together some demos and show you things that, maybe you will find interesting enough to pursue on your own. So definitely, let me see if there's anything else on the questions that I can pull up here. Just some general hellos, so that's cool. Good morning. Yes, it's afternoon over here. I'm like in Florida. It's definitely much later in the afternoon. Hello, Jose. Oftentimes there's a lot of people from everywhere, so that's cool. Maybe you can put in where you're from. Hello, Mr. V. Wow. So the people that call me Mr. V used to probably are some of my students from when I used to teach at a community college. So that's the only people that call me Mr. V. So awesome. Let's see. Yeah, so we already had the question about the BEM method, and you switched to GIMP. I'm not sure what you mean, Eric, about. I don't use GIMP. But Photoshop, yeah, maybe like was the comment about Photoshop is just so crazy. I'm old enough to like have used a very like version, I think 2 of Photoshop. So now I go into it and they've changed it so much every time I use it that I seem to have forgotten how to do like simple things. Hate that when I go to Illustrator, the same thing happens to me. So it looks like the CSS nesting was a little bit slow to load, but thank you. Dewana is doing all the links. I appreciate the comments from IDMX. I appreciate that, helping me out. So that's awesome. Let's see. We have Steven Steinbaker. Hello all. Hello everyone. Let's take a look at anything else. Cool. What extension? Yeah, I already answered the extension question. And Steven saying hi back to Dewana. Thank you so much, Dewana, for coming and helping out, because it makes me feel a little bit better when there's somebody helping me out. So that's kind of all I have. Like, make sure that you I don't know, like, subscribe, share. You can watch this stuff later if you arrived a little bit late. All this is stored, and you can go to, I have a YouTube channel, so like youtube.com/planet of the web. You can find it on LinkedIn, on my profile, or if you really want to watch a lot of the back episodes, then just go to rabo.org. The article for this is already up there with all the links from the show. So if you missed something, I'm running kind of, other than Dewana helping me now, I'm kind of doing everything as a one-man show here. So it's tough to run everything and try to do all the link overlays. So I decided to just kind of give you the page with the links later. So cool. Thank you so much for coming, and hopefully I'll see you again next week. Take care.